Hello everyone and welcome to another one of my live streams. Today I'm going to be talking to you about neurodiversity and trauma. This conversation came up, it comes up in a lot of conversations I have actually, and I really wanted to kind of explore a little bit of this today. Hopefully it won't be too heavy, and I also hope it'd be quite useful for you, particularly in a work context. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the neurodiversity and trauma relationship. Then I'm going to talk about what's kind of different, what can be different about neurodivergent trauma, how it can show up differently. Then I'm going to kind of apply that to work and workplaces and how it means, what that means for work and how we approach it. Obviously, a bit of a content warning on this one. I will be mentioning traumatic experiences, though there won't be detailed descriptions of anything too traumatic, but I will be talking about them. So please do ask questions if you're watching live, and I will try and bring them into the talk. A little bit about this. So this topic came up. It's something that I often speak to people about, and I found that people often find quite useful. It's been a bit of an issue for me and my own journey and understanding this, unpicking this, and what I'd like to really start with is sharing the model that I use, how I've come to understand this stuff. So, with neurodiversity and trauma, it's quite a complicated relationship, right? It's something that I think has been quite entangled. There are certain people out there who I definitely don't agree with, who believe that all neurodevelopmental conditions are solely based in trauma and are therefore should be approached that way. I use a different model, which is to say that there are neurodivergent conditions, neurodevelopmental conditions, acquired neurodivergent conditions, and then there is trauma as a separate but related thing. So in this model, you can be neurodivergent and you can be perfectly mentally well in the sense of not carrying any trauma, not carrying any disordered behavior, not carrying any difficulties beyond, just the difficulties of hitting the disabled barriers that we all face, if we're neurodivergent anyway. But there is also the possibility of having trauma, having life experiences that were too difficult to process, that mean that you've got these patterns of now unhelpful behavior that are really hard to shift. But equally, we can be otherwise neurotypical and have these patterns of trauma-related behavior that's really hard to shift. So they're kind of separate things. I do want to say with a little caveat, if you experience trauma and you live with it for a long time, your neurology is likely to change. So you could see otherwise neurotypical, but having experienced trauma and lived with it for a while as another form of neurodivergence. But to really tease these apart, this neurodevelopmental condition, say ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, whatever, as separate but related to trauma. And one of the reasons it's so difficult to separate and to pick apart is because when we are neurodivergent, we're sensitive to certain things, we're susceptible to certain things, given our particular condition. And that means that the environment out there that's not designed for us is quite likely to result in relatively consistent patterns of trauma, of overwhelm, of experience that we can't quite process and handle. So what we end up doing is having these kind of patterns on top of our lived experience. And that's a kind of confusing and difficult thing clinically. I think it's the root of a lot of the difficulties that clinicians have teasing these things apart, and people have teasing these things apart. So you've got these kind of patterns of trauma, and then you've got these, you've got the underlying condition. And a lot of the trauma that we have as neurodivergent people is related to really being in trouble, suffering for, being punished for things that were outside of our awareness, or even if they were in our awareness, were out of our control. They were things that we simply couldn't do and manage in quite the way that other people could. Now, one of the stranger things about trauma work and being neurodivergent is I think a lot of people, particularly if you're late discovery neurodivergent, you go into doing work around this. Maybe you go into therapy, maybe you do other self-development things, and you have this expectation, oh, okay, once I've done this, I'll be more normal. It'll be easier for me to fit in. I'll be more like other people. My responses will be more like other people. And this was kind of my expectation actually going into a lot of this. Instead, what happened was that I became less masked. I became more stereotypically neurodivergent than I was before I'd done all this work. So I think it's a really important thing to understand. If you're neurodivergent and you've experienced trauma, it might well result in masking. And with that masking, there's a very high chance that when you get rid of that trauma, you'll actually become less, in inverted commas, normal, and actually perhaps show more of the outward symptoms, experiences associated with being neurodivergent than you otherwise would. I'd like to move on to thinking about where neurodivergent trauma actually comes from, particularly. Why is this a thing for neurodivergent people? Why is this a particular difficulty? And the biggest thing, I think, for me I just want to go through some of these and talk about them. So the first one of these is sensory trauma. Now, sensory trauma is really the fact that when we experience the world differently, sensory things can be overwhelming. Loud noises, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations, light, brightness, all of these different things can be really, really overwhelming. And we can experience them as being completely out of our control and having really difficult experiences, even to the point at which we can't stay functional in a situation. And that can be really difficult and compounded with the fact that sometimes we're not allowed to leave those spaces, saying I'm overwhelmed, I can't handle this, because it's outside of other people's experience. It's like, why would you find a loud space? Why would you find a supermarket, for example, as an example from my own childhood, an overwhelming space to be in, and then people not understanding. So we get this kind of sensory trauma, and then the invalidation of that as well. And related to this is social trauma. Now, social trauma is very much this kind of, okay, I thought I was doing this. I wanted to behave in this way. I wanted to express myself. I wanted to convey this experience, and I got completely opposite reaction, or I didn't get the right reaction, or I was misunderstood, misinterpreted, or a whole load of other things. And if you're interested in misunderstandings and misinterpreting and social trauma, take a look at some of my previous live stream on neurodiversity and misunderstandings, because I think that would be a really, really good place to explore more around where social trauma comes from. One of the other things I wanted to pick up, which I think is perhaps less grounded in kind of pure psychology theory, but I think is really valid in this context, is educational trauma. And you can see in the resources there's a link to what educational trauma is and why we pick it up. But these negative experiences in an educational context, which can be both doing really well, doing really badly, doing well in the wrong way, which is definitely a thing that is for a lot of us, is a real challenge, and can leave us, even as adults, with difficulties around working with qualifications, being in the workplace, with the idea of being assessed by other people. I do wonder whether a lot of the, in inverted commas, sensitivity to criticism that a lot of neurodivergent people have is really related to the fact that we've experienced a ton of trauma around this. We've experienced some really horrible things. So any sense that we're being evaluated or criticized in that way feels unsafe and unwelcome. And so there is something really interesting to unpick there. And I really suggest, for everyone, maybe take a look at that and have a think about, like, where in your educational experiences is still kind of showing up in work that might be causing you issues around this. Now, one of the other things I'd like to mention, and I think doesn't always get spoken about, and it kind of is an emerging area around where neurodivergent trauma comes from, is CPTSD, which stands for Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. Now, when post-traumatic stress disorder first came out, it was very much associated with huge traumatic singular events. So, people who'd been in disaster scenarios or had been in combat scenarios, all sorts of really difficult, those kind of classically traumatic events. Now, that kind of idea of PTSD, I think, has lingered, and what trauma has lingered in the wider the wider outside of psychology worldview. But what we've also started to discover more recently is this idea of CPTSD, which is repeated, potentially smaller trauma. There's still trauma; it's still overwhelm, but it adds up over time. And I think one of the really big challenges around the being neurodivergent is we have a very high chance of having a lot of small traumas that we never quite get to the bottom of and never quite get to process, because the world doesn't really allow us that. So I think it's a really interesting angle to look at why neurodivergent trauma shows up in the way that it does. Now, there are an awful lot of methods of processing and integrating our experiences, which is kind of the root of dealing with a lot of this trauma. Not all of them are perfect, and some of them are predicated on assumptions that may not work for you as a neurodivergent person. In my experience, the most effective things, if you are thinking about exploring this a bit more, is really somatic things that have a somatic element, have an embodied element that help you get into the body. Because for me, an awful lot of the experience of trauma is actually held in the body, almost in physical tension. And that's why I think sometimes we can have those weird experiences doing something physical. I don't know if you do, you've ever had a massage or done yoga or done something really physical, and then suddenly felt this huge outwelling of emotion that was kind of stored somehow in the body. And so it's really worth exploring these things. I think particularly because it can be a more direct way than some of the more cognitive methods that either use metaphor or use techniques that don't always work for us as neurodivergent people. Now, what I'd like to kind of start to round up this talk is really thinking about neurodivergent trauma and the workplace. Now, trauma-informed workplaces in general are kind of a new idea, I think. And the idea, we've unfortunately picked up a work culture that kind of thinks about pushing through, getting over things, and actually ignoring a lot of this stuff. It's only in the last few years that we've started to realize quite how damaging that can be in general for all people at work. And the idea of neurodivergent trauma on top of that is even more difficult. I want to go back to the thing I mentioned before, that sometimes our experiences, what we might experience as overwhelming as neurodivergent people, as people sensitive to different things in the environment, in the world, don't always line up with other people's expectations of those. And if we have senior people around us who really need to see things that only they would find overwhelming or difficult and will only accept that as valid, we might well experience our own trauma around that as well as finding the thing overwhelming. This, invalidation of experience, I think, is the root of a lot of difficulty. We face a lot of stigma around conditions still, unfortunately, and this can lead to the masking and camouflaging that I've also spoken about in previous episodes. Now, this masking is actually a really costly thing, and it's a really costly thing not just to the individual, though it is a really costly thing to the individual, but to the organization itself. And I really think this message needs repeating as often as possible. The value of neurodivergent people is the unique strengths and perspectives that we can offer into that wider workplace context. If we are required to mask to stay safe, not to be overwhelmed, you are cutting off all of that benefit, all of that value. You basically, as a workplace, you have the choice between a really excellent, sensitive, neurodivergent person, or at best, a mediocre, miserable person pretending to be a neurotypical. And it's making sure that we're not facing overwhelm, not facing extra struggles. That ensures that you get the access to the really unique talents that people who don't experience the world like everyone else can offer. And I know a lot of workplaces are starting to wake up to this, and there are, there's all sorts of different ways of supporting and accommodating neurodivergent people, and we are slightly getting better. I think it's really, really important to look at the individual, though. There's, unfortunately, like a lot of these things, it's become kind of commoditized, standardized, and every individual experiences things differently and has different needs, and will have had different experiences in the past that will make some things feel safe and make some things feel unsafe. So the extent to which we can say, yes, this person needs that particular thing is relatively limited. It's really about focusing on people's own experiences, own strengths, and building from there. One of the resources below is about the how important coaching in the case of dyslexic people can be. And what it finds is, if it's done well, it can be really effective. But it can also be really difficult, and if it's not done well, it doesn't help at all and can even have a negative effect. So there are really important considerations about the individual needs and the individual approach that we need to consider when we're thinking about this, and when we're thinking about ourselves and our own needs as well. I think, unfortunately, this means that we might have to do a fair bit of trial and error before we can really necessarily kind of fix this. There aren't quick fixes for this. And that's particularly true because we have to deal with some of this stuff on an ongoing basis. It's an interesting question about to say whether it's, for example, hypervigilance, in the sense of, which is a very common trauma response, which is this always scanning the environment for threats. It's like, is it hypervigilance if you could be misunderstood and get into a ton of trouble as a neurodivergent person in the workplace? That's not hypervigilance. That's an appropriate level of vigilance to an unhealthy workplace. So there are really important things to consider about whether this is just an adaptive response to an unhealthy environment. And I think when we start to see these kind of avoidance strategies, these things we have to be really careful about showing up, then that's a sign that perhaps the environment isn't as supportive as it could be. And I wanted to include this, the pre-justification trait that shows up for so many neurodivergent people in the workplace. That urge to have to explain yourself in detail when you ask for anything or request anything. Having, for me, always wondering why some people could just write an email and say, I want this, and that would be fine. Whereas I felt the need to, add evidence and justify everything, even if it was a perfectly normal need or request. So I think knowing where we feel like we're working with the system and trying to work around the system and trying to stay safe, trying to get our needs met and spending a lot of effort doing it, is a good pointer to things that really aren't working as smoothly as they could in the workplace and could be a good place to improve. If you happen to work on your own, I think some of this is a little bit different and shifts a little bit as now I work on my own as well. There is a real different take to this, though we can still be carrying the patterns from past workplaces. So it's really worth exploring whether we need to continue doing those things, some of the things that we might find difficult, or whether we can actually drop some of that, make our lives a bit easier and work more in our own way and still get what we want done. Because for me, that's actually a lot of the reason to work for yourself, is because you don't have to justify it to someone else. You just have to make something that works for other people. So I hope that was a useful kind of quick run through neurodiversity, trauma, and work. If you've got any questions, please do either ask in the comments or drop me a message privately. I know there is stigma and these things can be quite private. So if you've got any questions that you don't want to be shared, please do just drop me a private message. If there are any other topics you'd also like to see me talk about, please do share those in the comments. That would be incredibly helpful to hear more about. And there are links to all of the references and resources that I shared, and there will be very shortly a full transcript of this talk available on the website that you can find in the show notes as well. So I hope that was useful, and I will see you again soon.